Hi, and welcome back to the final day of Global Fact 8. YouTube's been making announcements about its effort to crack down on misinformation. So welcome to this panel where we'll discuss misinformation, YouTube and fact-checking. I'm Phoebe Arnold from Full Fact, and here with me are Gemma Mendoza, head Rappler from Rappler, Brandi Geurkink from Mozilla, and David Schraven from Correctiv. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
There's widespread concern about the spread of unchecked misinformation on YouTube. Many fact-checkers encounter YouTube links containing misinformation every day through Facebook's fact-checking program, their own monitoring, and reader requests. In the run-up to this panel, I asked ISBN signatories to send examples of misinformation on YouTube, and the results were worrying. As well as all the COVID vaccine misinformation you might expect, there were also fact-checked videos containing harmful health misinformation about other vaccines and things like false cures for cancer. There was a lot of political misinformation, for example, allegations that elections have been subject to fraud, and also misinformation that seemed intended to stoke societal or religious divisions. All in all, we've had more than 250 examples so far. As I looked through these, I could see that a few of them have been removed from YouTube, but definitely not all. And we'll talk a bit more about removal versus contextualization later. As many of you will know, monitoring on YouTube is really hard. CrowdTungle doesn't include YouTube. You can't collect channels to find repeat offenders, and videos are often very, very long and containing numerous claims. Even for organizations like Full Fact and others which have tech teams and automatic claim detection, the processing required to transcribe these videos is prohibitively expensive. And if you're using automatic transcription outside of English, it's basically useless for a lot of us. From interviews that I conducted last year with 30% of fact checkers, I learned that there's almost universal agreement that YouTube should do more. For example, creating a paid structured program for fact checkers to check this information on YouTube. Although ideas about what that would look like in practice are rough because we just don't have enough insight into the nature and the scope of misinformation on YouTube and what YouTube is already doing to counteract it. My research also revealed a widespread sense that YouTube is hiding behind other tech companies which are doing more and doing the bare minimum to accommodate fact checkers rather than working with us in a strategic way to tackle misinformation. We plan to publish that research shortly for everyone to see. As I mentioned, YouTube doesn't seem to do a lot to engage with fact checkers and has largely escaped criticism due to the US media scrutiny on Facebook. We actually did invite YouTube to this panel, but there were no takers to join us. YouTube's recently published 2 statements on tackling misinformation, which many of you might have seen. A new policy on vaccines announced in September this year, and also an update on their approach to tackling misinformation, which highlighted their removal of content and raising up authoritative information. There was nothing about working with independent, non-partisan fact checkers or the possibilities of labeling and contextualizing. So let's roll back a bit first and discuss some of the key challenges of fact-checking misinformation on YouTube, how fact-checking could be integrated into the platform, and how we could work together to better reduce the spread of harmful information on this platform. So I'm going to take Gemma, David, then Brandi. What have you learned via your fact-checking or research about the key challenges in tackling the spread of misinformation on YouTube? Gemma, you first.
Hi, Phoebe. So we've been fact-checking for years now, and there's this one fact-check I'd like to mention that we did back in 2018. It's a video, very fantastic claim. Supposedly, the family of the late dictator owns 1 million tons of gold. That landed in the most bizarre, the finalists to the most bizarre fact checks in Global Fact years ago in 2019. But at the time, what we did that we at the time we fact checked it, there were about 1 million views to that video. Now there are 2.1 million views as of just now. I checked just now, and there's 2.1 million views. So just to tell you that nothing happens, like basically something fantastic, something totally ridiculous, it's still there. And that might seem funny, but the thing is that's being used for political purposes. So right now we're nearing an elections. There's an elections coming happening in May 2022, and one of those running for public office for the president is the son of the late dictator. And one of the critical issues against him is the unexplained wealth, the loot of the father. And that is being used. The gold story is being used to explain away the family's wealth, explain away, and hide the fact that there were cases that were actually filed against them. There were actually there's a very recent ruling that required them to return loot and so on. That's all being hidden by these fantastic claims about gold and supposedly them owning 1,000,000 tons of gold, which is really fantastic. So that's one very big example of how something like that, something fantastic, can stay on and gain audience.
Thanks, Gemma. And yeah, I guess if you've got elections coming up, all of this must feel particularly critical to you. Mm-hmm. David, would you like to take the question next? What you've learned by your fact-checking about challenges in tackling misinformation?
What I think what is most important is still that from our observation, YouTube is responsible for, I don't know, almost half of all the misinformation that is spread in the World Wide Web, at least in Germany. And this is a big problem because the policies YouTube is taking to counter this massive influence of disinformation are not working. In Germany, they use the tactics of deleting channels or deleting content they don't like or whatever. But it seems to people from the outside just arbitrary. Or it reminds one to censorship even. If, for example, Russia Today was deleted or banned from YouTube, but on the other hand, other channels that broadcast quite the same stuff or even worse stuff are still online and still broadcasting. I think if we go down the path of deleting, of just getting rid of stuff, we won't solve the problem of disinformation, but we will create a lot of new stuff that is going around. And this is exactly what I see with YouTube's policy. And this gives me a lot of headaches, I need to say. We don't see problems solved, we see problems worsen.
Thanks, David. And yeah, I guess ideally we would be avoiding a situation where it seems like some executives in another country are making decisions about what we can and can't talk about. And I think platforms need to be more transparent and open about their moderation processes. Brandi, you've done some really interesting research at Mozilla about regrettable videos. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So our research has focused on YouTube's algorithm specifically and looking at the ways that YouTube's algorithm surfaces content to people that they find to be regrettable, they find to be harmful, which definitely over the course of our research we found includes myths and disinformation. So what we did is we actually created a browser extension to crowdsource examples from people of videos that YouTube recommended to them that they later regretted watching. And we ended up recruiting more than 37,000 people across 191 countries to participate in our research. And the three main things that we found over the course of doing this, the first was that most of the videos that people regretted watching actually came from recommendations. That was about 70% of the total videos that we analyzed were actually recommended to people by YouTube, suggesting that the algorithm is a big source of concern for a lot of YouTube's own user base. The second thing we found was that YouTube's algorithm recommends videos that violate their very own policies. So for example, we found that videos had been recommended to people that were later removed from the platform because they were in violation of, say, YouTube's policies on medical misinformation, for example. It's important to know on the transparency front that only in about 40% of the cases that we analyzed did YouTube actually provide a reason for why a video was taken down that enabled us to make that assessment of what the reason for why the video was removed was. So there's very inconsistent labeling on the platform in that regard. that really hindered our ability to fully understand the role of the algorithm in recommending videos that violate YouTube's community guidelines. And the third thing that we found is quite interesting and reinforces a point I think that Gemma made, is that the non-English speaking world is really being hit the hardest by YouTube's failures in this regard. So we found that 60%, or the rate of regrets, say, was, this is what we called the videos that people sent into us. We call them YouTube regrets. And that rate was 60% higher in countries where English is not the primary language. So there was really a big geographic discrepancy between YouTube's efforts to deal with harmful content and reduce recommendations of that type of content, including misinformation. I think the last thing just to say about, again, on the note of transparency, is that we did this research. We really believe that what we found through this research was the tip of the iceberg of, some of the problems that we see on YouTube. So I don't think that it should be the case that, independent organizations need to be creating browser extensions to study an algorithm that is so consequential. YouTube is the second most visited website in the world, and the recommendation algorithm drives more than 700 million hours of watch time on the platform every single day. So it's really our view that there needs to be much more transparency than there is currently into the platform and into the role of the recommendation algorithm in particular.
Thanks, Brandi. And yeah, I'm sure what you were saying about those global disparities will resonate among a lot of the people watching here. And yeah, kind of on the transparency point, I think one of the problems that we've talked about in this group before the panel was the fact that being on YouTube is a bit like being dropped in the middle of the ocean. There's just really no way of orientating yourself about, what's trending, what misinformation is the real problem, and trying to get a sense of that so you know what to fact check is really, really difficult. So Gemma, we've seen from YouTube's recent announcements that they seem to be trying to frame the debate about a question of removing or not removing content. But we know that there's a lot of scope to be much more creative than that. What do you think is a way, or what do you think are the best ways of effectively injecting fact-checking into that platform, which is so different from Facebook, where we already have a way of doing that?
Yeah, so the thing to remember about YouTube is it's a streaming service. So people don't read on YouTube, people watch on YouTube. And then when they're done watching the one video, something else crops up. So I'm sure YouTube, being a very big platform, has done quite a lot of usability studies in relation to how people use their systems, how people use their service, and therefore really there needs to be more research on how to serve correcting. Content corrects the content that has been fact checked, but right now there's none. So there's no way for people to understand, like something that's served might have might have misinformation. There's no labeling. There's nothing that signals anything, and pretty much when you do try to look for, what we did, for instance, when we were doing a fact checks in video. So we tried doing that because supposedly there are these content gaps, and we wanted to target those content gaps. And what's happening is that we tried to do whatever things that are we tried to copy at least the style of YouTube videos, in the sense that it's tabloidish. People tend to use all caps and so on. Very, 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 very visual. We tried to do that. We tried to tweak the keywords and so on. But it's really so hard to get. And it improved slightly the performance. Just sort of got into the recommendation of the target videos, but it didn't do a lot. And what we're still seeing is this content which we fact check still get more views than the content that's the content that's content that fact checking content still get less views than the content we fact check. So that's consistent.
Thanks, Gemma. That's all really fascinating. It's such a different kind of platform. And I think, yeah, it's possibly not enough to just insert fact checks into search results. We also need to think a bit more creatively about how to get those fact checks into the places where people are actually watching and taking the information in better. So zooming out a bit, David, we know the European Commission is supportive of Americans and of platforms using our work. What kind of scope do you think there is to integrate fact checks into platforms like YouTube using those European regulatory discussions that are happening at the moment?
I think this is a very important question. The point is the European Union has got now a couple of legislation processes going on. One is on the question how platforms like YouTube should be regulated. And I guess the policies YouTube is playing out with this canceling stuff or deleting bad content is a way for them to move forward in the face of the European Union and show, okay, we do something, we do take care. And I think the European Union is waiting for us, is waiting for our voice to be heard so that they understand what we think about this. And as Gemma said, I think it's very, very important to deliver content that gives context to the misinformation on YouTube, and it must be in the same format. It must be video. It must be something that people will see, not read. Nobody reads on YouTube. It's completely crazy to have a fact check in text on YouTube. And I guess the European Union is eager to take action. They really want to do something that helps us counter disinformation on YouTube.
Cool. Thanks, David. I totally agree with that. Brandi, is there anything you'd like to add? I know you guys are doing work on this as well.
Yeah, so I'll just highlight briefly two initiatives from within Europe that I think are key to focus on. So I think the first would clearly be the Digital Services Act. And what I'd just say about the DSA is that while it doesn't address misinformation directly per se, it's really focused on addressing the structural factors that enable the spread of mis and disinformation online. So, for example, it includes provisions on risk management, auditing, transparency in recommender systems and online advertisements, data access for researchers, and other provisions that are really important, I think, within the broader scope of preventing the spread of online mis and disinformation. The second piece to speak to fact checking specifically would be the code of practice on disinformation. And I think that the European Commission is really hoping that the revised code of practice will include more robust commitments from platforms to engage with the fact-checking community, which is great. That's really good. And I think that there's an important role for the fact-checking community to contribute to the development of that cooperation, for example, by joining the code directly or by participating in the monitoring framework.
Great, thanks, Brandi. We've got a few audience questions, but first I just wanted to follow up on what you were saying about fact checkers getting more involved in those sorts of discussions. So it's quite commonly agreed, as far as I can tell, that we can have a louder voice by speaking together on some issues. The question is how to do that, and especially because we're quite a young industry. And Brandi, I thought as a kind of relative outsider to fact checking, you might have some thoughts about how we could work together better to raise our voices.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that particularly on the topic of transparency, there's a lot of room for cooperation. I think that the fact-checking community has so much hands-on experience in working with some of these platforms and look at studying the platforms directly and understanding the information that they're providing to different communities around the world. So I think that that's a really interesting area for us to think about more cooperation, because I think that YouTube is one of the least transparent social media platforms, but that they don't really have that image actually in comparison to platforms like Facebook. So I think that there's a lot that we could do by joining together to talk about the need for greater transparency, bringing in some really practical examples of how this plays out by engaging more with the fact-checking community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so bringing kind of examples and testimony to the debate from the front line.
Yeah.
Gemma and David, you've been working in this field a long time. Do you have any thoughts on that question about how we could do joints of advocacy or activity together better?
What I think, we really should work together on the legislation, on the parliaments in the US and in the European Union, to push them even hard and push them as loud as we can, because every day we lose on action, we lose ground to the disinformation campaigns, and the results we see everywhere. Right now in the European Union, we've got big trouble in Poland, we got big trouble in Southeast Europe, and this is also caused by disinformation. And if we don't do anything about it and do it quickly, we will have major political consequences. People are using these disinformation campaigns to destabilize democracies. And I see this is like a common thing we should do together in an open letter or whatsoever. But on the other hand, I also see some trouble in regional parts. So it might be different in a country like Philippines or in countries like Brazil, where you encounter completely different difficulties. And there might be other policies put better in place. But what I really think is crucial, most crucial right now, is joining efforts in the US, in the European Union, and then go further down the line to other regions.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I think you're right. It may be that we need to work together better regionally. Sometimes perhaps using our kind of more global voice would be helpful. Gemma, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's not even the question of how, because it's more of like the why. Like, why should we like collaborate? Because it's really urgent. I mean, it's not something we can hold out like any longer. Like, we should be doing this already. It should be happening. We should be collaborating. We should be putting our voices to like joining our voices together and saying it louder. Like, so people will hear, people in these platforms will listen, and those in authorities will then also listen, because things are happening. This is not just a question of entertainment. This is not just a question of content. This is a question of societies and democracies that are being affected.
Urgent. Okay, so moving on to some audience questions. The first one I might ask Gemma, but perhaps you'll all have views. And it's a question about kind of displacement of content. So I guess this is not just to do with YouTube, but this question refers to YouTube. If you end up sort of dealing with misinformation or disinformation on a platform properly, it might get pushed off to somewhere like BitChute or Rumble in Canada. And the question is, how do we tackle the whole video misinformation ecosystem? Or should we continue to focus our efforts on YouTube because it's such a popular platform in so many countries? Gemma, what do you think about that?
I think the question is the mainstream. Like, what the mainstream is looking at, what the mainstream is using. So right now in the Philippines, like years ago, YouTube was not as big a concern as, say, Facebook, because the top social media network was Facebook. But right now, YouTube is the top. Like, as of the last quarter of last year, YouTube is already the top social media platform, mainly because like people are at home and watching their video and streaming video in their mobile phones and on television. So it's not. Yes, it is it can be that these people, these information actors, will then eventually go to other places. But the point is, would they be able to target the mainstream audiences in those places, in those nooks in the internet? There will always be some nook for these content. But the point is, right now, it is affecting our children. My own children are watching YouTube. Like, I'm sure there are a lot of parents out there who are concerned about this, and it's not even like you cannot even consider like just using some of the other supposedly derivative platforms for kids. Like, there are ways to get around all the filtering. So really, something needs to be done. And we may not be able to tackle the entire internet, but at the very least, we're protecting the mainstream. We're protecting the bigger audiences.
Thanks, Gemma. And yeah, Brandi, what do you make of this question? I think there's perhaps a balance between tackling the whole misinformation ecosystem via platform kind of cooperation, like that's one way of doing it. But I suppose Evelyn Dukes sort of talked about content cartels and how you don't want the sort of small cadre of people controlling what spreads and what's seen online. What's your take?
Yeah, so I have two thoughts on this. I think the first is that this does definitely factor into the transparency question overall. I think that when it comes to thinking about a holistic approach to reducing the spread of mis and disinformation, there is definitely scope for greater cooperation between platforms and between service providers around providing data to researchers and otherwise that could help us study some of these things at the ecosystem level. So I think that's the first thing. And the second is, I suppose, one of the things I shared our research found was around how YouTube's algorithm itself was amplifying and promoting misinformation to people. I think that's really important. It's another dynamic. There's the dynamic of, how are things getting shared within existing social networks, within, WhatsApp groups, otherwise Facebook groups, these kinds of things. And then there's a question about, how might a platform just be surfacing some of this type of content to somebody who just happens to be, watching autoplay videos or otherwise. And I think that the tactics to dealing with those problems look very different. And so some of the benefit in focusing on YouTube could be that, at least our research has shown that very much is a reality on the platform that requires sort of a different solution to the other one that I mentioned.
Cool, thanks. David, is there anything to add, or should we move to another question?
No, nothing to add.
Cool. Okay, so the next question from the audience is about the kind of practicalities of putting fact checks on YouTube. So they're asking, people are used to seeing overlays in videos, so links, ads, subtitles. What do we think would be an effective way to insert fact checks in video format? And I love this question because I love practical questions.
May I answer?
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the way. YouTube already has got the option to put in context to their own content. And the context YouTube is using is ads, advertising, and some links. And we can use exactly this way to bring our fact checks on the disinformation to the videos without deleting them. And I think it's so important to really put it at the point where the misinformation is. When somebody tells you that people never landed on the moon, then there must be a small flag saying, here's more context about this. People were indeed on the moon. You may believe other things like the big spaghetti monster is the new God in heaven, but it doesn't change the factual world. And this should be exactly there in this small boxes where you have the overlays. Absolutely, that's the way.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of using fact checks. You're not telling anyone not to say something. You're not censoring them. You're just providing context in a sort of label that people are used to. And
it gets you rid of this problem of deleting stuff.
Yeah.
And deleting is really problematic. And this is like, okay, you have context, and it's possible to debate on the context. If somebody says, okay, what the fact checker wrote there or did there or screened there is wrong, you can argue about it. You can't argue with deleting, right?
Yeah, and as Brandi was saying, the reasons for deleting are often not that clear. Okay, we've got another question from the audience. What are the best tools to track misinformation on a daily basis on YouTube? Who would like to?
So that's the problem.
Go on, Gemma.
Yeah, so so the thing with streaming services is they do require more resources than something like text. Text you can just search. There's a feed and so on. But the thing with video is that you have to listen to the video. Otherwise, you don't get to spot the misinformation or the disinformation that you're going to fact check eventually. And the thing with that is that it's very taxing on the fact checker to do that. So I mean, like our researchers, for instance, they would like it's very stressful to be watching something that's really like you're basically listening to a stream of ideas that are just strung together. It freaks them out sometimes, and the problem with that is that yes, in some countries, for English speaking countries, for instance, it's not as big of a problem because you already have transcription services that can accurately transcribe audio into text, and therefore all the fact checker needs to double check is that, was this really what was said? And then you can start fact checking. In our case, a lot of this video are in Filipino or even in one of the about 100 languages here, and none of those languages, including Filipino, have accurate automated transcription services. So what that means is we really need to watch and listen and get freaked out, and that takes a lot of resources, but also. There are no resources out there right now because there's no arrangements at all that actually pays people who will do that and pays companies who will have to provide for counseling services for those people.
Yeah, I think definitely having more monitoring inside information would be good. We had a really great partnership with Google at Full Fact during the EU referendum, where they told us what kind of factual issues were getting the most search traffic. And I think that would be a really interesting sort of starting point for YouTube. What are the kind of keywords? What are the channels that are getting the most traffic? Just to give us a sense of where to start. But at the moment, like you said before we had this panel, Gemma, it was sort of dropped in the middle of the sea with no way of orientating ourselves. Okay, and just actually, I wanted to touch on that global aspect of the discussion. So I think perhaps some fact checkers would feel like, not just on YouTube, but other platforms as well, kind of product rollout and policy rollout can feel a bit haphazard. And there are kind of language difficulties. I wonder what your experience has been of that, Gemma. And Brandi, I know that you also had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, usually they say they rolled out some things, or there's supposedly some things that are being things that are being tested. Like for instance, media review was supposedly being tested, and I mean, to begin with, I have questions about whether it is effective, but it's not even. I don't even see it here. I mean, I have not seen anything that shows that. So in many, and it's not just YouTube. It's many platforms. They tend to prioritize the bigger markets, and countries like us who have who have smaller advertising markets. We tend to get forgotten, and like policies tend to be rolled out like years after when the damage has been done. So that's really a big problem.
Yeah, and definitely when you consider that some countries are used almost like a petri dish for developing disinformation techniques.
Yes.
Brandi, sorry, would you like to talk about that? Or
yes, precisely. So just on that one, just to point out that in these countries also, usually these are the countries where, news media to begin with are just nascent industries. They're not really like the knowledge of news, the knowledge of journalism, that's not really that big, that widespread yet. So usually people are more vulnerable because of that.
Thanks. And Brandi, you also had some thoughts about the kind of global nature of product rollouts and so on. Tell us about those.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, really just adding to a lot of what Gemma was saying and reinforcing that with YouTube in particular, one of the main things that it's sort of talking points that they often use to highlight the success of some of their policies to reduce the spread of harmful content via their recommendation system is that, they say they've introduced policy changes that have led to a 70% decrease in recommendations of harmful content. And then it's, for non-subscribed recommendations in the United States. And often that part gets missed when it's just a talking point on a panel or otherwise, and you have to do a bit of digging to understand, okay, this is actually talking about a very small, certainly a very small percentage of the global population, and then also questionably, YouTube's own user base, given the reach that they have globally. So I think that that's a really important point, that actually for 2 years was something that they were just saying, and it wasn't really clear where and if these policy changes had been rolled out elsewhere in the world. So it was only actually a few months ago that they updated a blog post to say, oh, and now these changes have actually been rolled out globally. So I think that's a really, really interesting thing to dig in on, is to say, oh, okay, well, so that took 2 years. And then also, are those changes actually working? What is the, what's the equivalent sort of statistic for the figure in other parts of the world? And there's just simply no transparency into that still.
Yeah, and thank God for your eagle eyes. It's very good to have people kind of looking into those sorts of questions. Okay, we just had another question, and I'll make this the last one before we wrap up. Somebody is asking about the German context. So maybe, David, you can take this one, where apparently there are a lot of lengthy videos from COVID deniers, which go on for a very long time. So kind of 30 minutes or an hour, sort of interspersed with opinions and facts and narratives, which, as you can understand, would consume a lot of time. The person is also saying that it takes a lot of time to produce good videos, more time than it would with text. So David, how do you deal with that kind of thing at Correctiv?
Sorry, right now we don't deal with that because we don't do this. it's no, for us it's just too difficult. It takes too much effort. It's too hard to do. But I think this is exactly where the overlays come in play. This is why we need the overlays. And if you got that, then you can pick up the most important parts of such a mixture of opinion, false facts, and false narratives. And you take the most disturbing ones, and therefore for the most disturbing ones, especially here when it comes to COVID deniers, then you can prepare stuff, and then you just pick it and put it where it's needed to be put. But this is the reason why we so strongly need the option to put in overlays.
Yeah, I totally see that. Okay, so we've just got 3 minutes left. I would love it if all of you could say what you'd like to be different in a year's time in terms of how misinformation is handled by YouTube. Gemma, would you like to go first?
Yeah, clearer policies, global implementation of those policies, because they shouldn't be forgetting the poorer countries. And then I think the other part of that is really you need support for people who will actually go through that quagmire. And it cannot be just something that you can get for free from some open data source, and that's unfair to those who are actually doing this work.
Thank you. Brandi?
Sure. I'd say greater transparency into what YouTube considers to be borderline content, more global enforcement of their existing policies, and transparency about how their recommendation algorithm plays a role in amplification of borderline content in a global context. And finally, just because I'm ambitious, I'd say tools for independent research and scrutiny of YouTube.
Fantastic, thanks. And David?
I think in 1 year's time, we should be debunking in video format. And to be very clear, YouTube should pay for that. They created the mess, they should pay for cleaning up.
Cool, nice and succinct. So yeah, it seems like we have a lot of ideas and understanding about this problem. And most of you will know by now that the fact-checking community is beginning to work together on this issue. And I think Carlos from Maldita will be in touch soon enough about activities for the rest of the year. If you want to get in touch with Carlos or me, you know where to find me. Or if you have other ideas about how to engage with YouTube or misinformation on that platform, I'd love to hear them. And all that remains is for me to thank my lovely panelists. Thank you, everyone. And I hope the audience enjoyed it. So coming up in about 15 minutes, we'll be chatting about global trends in the fact-checking community. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.